When Donald Trump stood before the G7 summit and flatly rejected claims that the United States had committed to funneling $300 billion toward Iran-related financial frameworks, most of the media covered it as a dispute over numbers, a technical disagreement, a negotiating posture. And if you walked away from that headline thinking, wow, well, someone got the figures wrong, then you've already fallen into the trap that was set for you, because this moment, this specific seemingly mundane rejection of a dollar figure at a multilateral summit is actually a window into something far larger and far more structurally important than a budgetary argument between diplomats. What we are witnessing is the unraveling of a financial architecture that was quietly assembled over decades, designed to manage global conflict through controlled economic pressure, and what Trump did by rejecting that framing was not just push back on a number. He stepped on a landmine that reveals the entire minefield beneath it. And that's where we need to go today. Because the realization I want you to hold on to, the one we're going to fully unpack before this is over, is that the Iran funding debate isn't really about Iran at all. It never was. Let's start with the G7 itself, because people fundamentally misunderstand what that institution is. Most Americans are taught to see it as a gathering of the world's leading democracies, a kind of high-minded forum where the most powerful and enlightened nations coordinate on shared values. And yes, on the surface, there are handshakes and communiques and press conferences about climate and trade. But underneath that, the G7 functions as something closer to a board meeting for a very specific economic order, one that was constructed in the aftermath of World War II and has been quietly managed ever since by a network of financial interests that don't appear on any ballot. The nations in that room are not there because they represent the free world. They are there because they control the primary mechanisms of dollar-denominated global trade, debt issuance, and sanctions enforcement. That's the actual membership criteria. And when you understand that, you begin to understand why a dispute about Iran funding inside that room is not a peripheral story. It is a core story about who controls the levers of that system and what they're prepared to do to protect it. Now let's talk about Iran specifically, because the Western narrative on Iran is one of the most sophisticated and sustained propaganda campaigns in modern geopolitical history. For the better part of 4 decades, Americans have been presented with a singular image of Iran, a rogue state, a sponsor of terrorism, an apocalyptic theocracy itching to destabilize the Middle East, and some of that narrative has real elements of truth woven into it, which is precisely what makes it effective. The best propaganda is never entirely false, but what that narrative consistently omits is the geopolitical logic underneath Iranian behavior. Iran sits at the intersection of 3 of the most strategically important territories on Earth, the Persian Gulf, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. It controls access to energy corridors that matter enormously to both Eastern and Western economic systems. And for the last several decades, it has been one of the primary testing grounds for the broader question of whether the dollar-based sanction system can actually bend a sovereign nation's government to the will of Washington and its financial partners. That question has enormous implications, not just for Iran, but for Russia, for China, and for any nation watching to see whether resistance to that system is viable. So when we talk about funding mechanisms tied to Iran, we're not really talking about humanitarian aid or diplomatic goodwill. We're talking about the management of that larger test. We're talking about the instruments used to calibrate how much pressure gets applied, and to whom and when and at what price. This is where Trump's rejection becomes genuinely fascinating, and I want you to sit with this for a moment. Ask yourself something, and I mean genuinely think about it before reading on. Why would a figure as allegedly transactional and deal-oriented as Donald Trump walk into a G7 meeting, one of the most choreographed diplomatic environments in the world, and publicly reject a financial framework in a way that contradicts what his own administration's diplomatic corps had apparently been working toward? The standard media answer is ego, impulsiveness, a desire to dominate the room, but that answer is lazy, and it's the answer of people who don't want to look at the structure. The more interesting answer is that Trump, whatever you think of him, represents a faction within American power that has a genuinely different theory about how to manage global leverage. Not necessarily a more moral theory, let's be clear about that, but a different one. One that is less committed to the multilateral institutions and more committed to bilateral coercion, to direct deal-making that bypasses the frameworks the post-war order constructed. And when you see him reject that $300 billion figure, you are watching that faction assert itself against the institutional machinery of the old order in real time. But to understand why this matters, we have to look at where that $300 billion figure actually comes from, because it didn't appear out of thin air. It's connected to a broader architecture of frozen assets, reparations frameworks, sanctions relief mechanisms, and what I would describe as the financial plumbing that Western governments use to manage relationships with adversarial states. You have Iranian sovereign wealth frozen in foreign jurisdictions. You have structures built under the original JCPOA framework and its successors. You have European banking interests that want certainty about what the legal environment looks like for any re-engagement with Iranian markets. And you have, critically, a set of Gulf state actors, particularly in the UAE and Qatar, who have been quietly building economic bridges to Tehran, even while publicly aligning with Washington's security posture. That $300 billion figure, in other words, represents the valuation of a complex web of interests, some of them financial, some of them geopolitical, some of them deeply personal for specific families and institutions who have money tied up in these mechanisms. Trump rejecting that number is not just a policy position, it is a declaration that he does not recognize the legitimacy of those claims, or at least not at that price. And here is where the chessboard metaphor becomes essential, because what we're looking at right now in the Middle East and in the broader context of these negotiations is not a simple conflict between America and Iran. It is a multi-board chess game where the same pieces are being moved simultaneously in the Gulf, in Washington's domestic political theater, in the back rooms of European banking, and in the emerging economic architecture that China and Russia are quietly constructing as an alternative to the dollar system. Every move on one board affects the position on all the others. When Trump rejects a financial framework at G7, he simultaneously sends a signal to Beijing, which is watching Iran's negotiating leverage very carefully, and to Moscow, which has its own economic threads tied to Iranian energy infrastructure, and to the European Central Bank, which has institutions exposed to the legal uncertainty around Iranian assets. It is not a simple story, it never is. And the people reducing it to a simple story are either incapable of seeing the complexity or they have a reason for you not to see it. Let me bring in the broader economic dimension here, because I think this is the part that most American audiences are missing almost entirely. We are living through the most significant restructuring of global monetary architecture since Bretton Woods. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, the thing that has underwritten American financial hegemony for 80 years, is under sustained structural pressure. Not immediate collapse, let's be precise about that, but genuine, compounding erosion. The BRICS expansion, the growing use of bilateral trade settlements in non-dollar currencies, China's digital yuan infrastructure, India's quiet diversification of reserve holdings, these are not disconnected news items. They are different expressions of the same tectonic shift. And Iran, of all places, has become one of the most important laboratories for this shift, precisely because Iran has been locked out of the dollar system by sanctions and has therefore been forced to develop alternative settlement mechanisms. Some of those mechanisms are now being studied and adapted by other nations that want the option of operating outside dollar jurisdiction. So when we're talking about Iran funding at the G7, we are talking indirectly about the fight to determine whether the dollar system maintains its monopoly or whether viable alternatives continue to develop and spread. This is the critical realization I promised you at the beginning. The Iran debate is a proxy war for the dollar. And the $300 billion in question isn't really about enriching Tehran or funding Iranian proxies or any of the other framings you'll see in the mainstream press. It's about who controls the mechanism by which that money moves, what legal and financial system governs its release and its destination, and whether the outcome of this negotiation strengthens or weakens the institutional architecture of dollar primacy. That's why it's being fought over with such unusual intensity. That's why European leaders are more animated about it than their populations would expect given the stated stakes. And that's why Trump's rejection of it landed like a stone in still water. Because it wasn't just a number he was pushing back on. It was a whole theory of how financial power should be organized and who should be at the center of it. Now, I want to be careful here, because I don't want to romanticize any actor in this story. Trump is not a hero of a new multipolar world. The faction he represents has its own imperial logic. It simply prefers American unilateral leverage to the kind of managed multilateralism that institutions like the G7 embody. And Iran is not some innocent victim of Western aggression. The Iranian government has its own repressive machinery, its own regional ambitions, its own very complicated relationship with the proxy conflicts that have consumed so much life in Lebanon and Syria and Yemen. What I'm describing is not a morality play with heroes and villains, it's a power analysis. And the power analysis tells us that what's happening at these summits, behind the communiques and the photo opportunities, is a struggle between competing visions of how global financial leverage should be deployed and who gets to sit at the table when the rules are written. Most of you watching this will never be invited to that table, which is exactly why you need to understand what's happening there. Here's a question worth sitting with, and I genuinely want your perspective in the comments on this one. If the sanctions architecture against Iran has been running for over 40 years and has not produced regime change, has not fundamentally altered Iranian foreign policy, and has cost the American-led system enormous diplomatic capital with the global South, at what point does the continuation of that architecture stop being a strategic tool and start being an institutional habit that serves specific financial and political interests within the system itself? Because I think that's where we actually are. The Iran sanctions regime has become, in some ways, its own ecosystem. It employs thousands of lawyers, compliance officers, lobbyists, think tank analysts, and government officials. It generates consulting fees and legal fees and political donations. It provides leverage not just over Iran, but over third-party nations who fear secondary sanctions exposure. The original strategic rationale, containing Iranian nuclear ambitions, modifying Iranian regional behavior, has become almost secondary to the institutional machinery that grew up around it. And that's precisely the kind of dynamic that makes these negotiations so explosive, because any genuine resolution threatens not just a geopolitical arrangement, but a financial ecosystem built around the absence of resolution. The G7 context adds another layer to this. Think about who's in that room and what their domestic political pressures are. You have European leaders who are managing populations increasingly skeptical of American foreign policy leadership, particularly after Ukraine has revealed the economic costs of European alignment with Washington's strategic priorities. German industrial competitiveness has been genuinely damaged by the energy disruptions connected to the Ukraine conflict and the resulting sanctions architecture. French political leadership is navigating a deeply fractured domestic landscape where the traditional centrist consensus has broken down. And British foreign policy is operating in a post-Brexit context where the relationship between London's financial sector interests and its diplomatic postures is more exposed than it's been in generations. So when these leaders are sitting across from Trump and arguing about a $300 billion Iran-related financial framework, they're not just arguing about Iran, they're each processing this through the lens of their own political survival and their own economic constituencies. That's always the reality at these summits, and the media almost never gives you that lens because it would require acknowledging that the system is not, in fact, a harmonious concert of democracies. It is a negotiation between elites whose interests frequently diverge from those of the populations they govern. Let me bring this forward to the immediate future, because I think what happens in the next 60 to 90 days in the Iran negotiation space is going to be genuinely revealing. There are several tracks operating simultaneously. There is the formal diplomatic track, which involves the sequencing of sanctions relief, nuclear program limitations, and verification mechanisms. There is the back-channel financial track, which involves the specifics of asset release, currency conversion, and the legal frameworks governing what happens to frozen funds. And there is the regional security track, which involves the behavior of Iranian-aligned forces in the broader Middle East and the question of whether a diplomatic opening changes the calculus on the ground. Trump's public rejection of the $300 billion figure is going to create pressure in all three of those tracks simultaneously. It signals to the Iranian side that the American negotiating position is hardening, or at least becoming less predictable. It signals to the Europeans that they cannot assume American alignment with the financial frameworks they've been building, and it signals to the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that the American posture toward Iran may be shifting in ways that require them to recalibrate their own, already complex relationships with Tehran. What does this mean for ordinary Americans? And I ask that not rhetorically but genuinely, because I think this is where the intellectual exercise has to connect to something real. The Iran dynamic, the dollar system, the G7 power struggles. These feel abstract until you connect them to what's happening in your economy. The dollar's reserve currency status is not just a geopolitical asset. It is the mechanism through which the United States has been able to run sustained trade deficits, finance its debt at relatively low cost, and maintain a standard of living for its middle class that would not otherwise be supportable given its actual productive output. As that status erodes, and it is eroding structurally, gradually but unmistakably, the consequences eventually come home, not next quarter, but in the economic trajectory of the next decade. And the decisions being made right now in these rooms about who controls the financial architecture of the Iran deal, about whether the dollar system maintains its monopoly on global settlement, about whether the G7 remains the de facto board of directors of the global economy, those decisions are part of the larger story of what the American economic future looks like. You have a stake in this. And I'd argue that the fact you're watching a video like this means you already understand intuitively that the stakes are higher than the mainstream conversation admits. Here's something I genuinely want to hear from you in the comments, because I think this community has real insight on it, given everything you know about the history of American engagement with Iran, from the CIA-backed coup in 1953, to the hostage crisis, to the JCPOA and its collapse, to where we are today. Do you believe there is a genuine American strategic interest in a real resolution with Iran? Or do you believe the conflict has become so institutionalized, so embedded in the defense industry, the lobbying ecosystem, and the political fundraising architecture that resolution is structurally impossible regardless of who is in office? That's not a rhetorical question. That's the question that historians 50 years from now are going to identify as the one that people in this era should have been asking. Let me close with this. The moment Trump rejected that $300 billion figure at the G7, he did something that, regardless of his intention, briefly lifted the curtain. He revealed that the number had been agreed to somewhere, by someone, in some process that was not transparent and was not democratic. He revealed that the multilateral framework, which presents itself as a consensus-based, rules-governed system, is actually a negotiation between specific interests that are not always visible to the public, and he revealed, most importantly, that the financial architecture around Iran is not primarily humanitarian or security-focused. It is a power instrument, a tool for managing leverage in the largest geopolitical competition of the century. Whether you admire Trump or despise him, that moment of refusal was clarifying. Not because he is right, necessarily, but because his refusal exposed what the acceptance had been concealing. And in geopolitics, as in life, what is exposed can no longer be hidden behind the comfortable language of diplomacy and international cooperation. The question now is what we do with what we've seen. I'll leave that with you.